Have you ever dreamed of buying your own cask of Bruichladdich whiskey? Well, this video is going to help you, whether you're an independent bottler, whether you're somebody who just wants to do your own private bottling at some point, or whether you just want to buy and own one for the sake of buying and owning a cask of Bruichladdich. This is the video for you. Now, we've done 2 other videos in this series about Macallan, buying a cask of Macallan and buying a cask of Springbank. So today I'm going to go through about how to buy a cask of Bruichladdich, because the Bruichladdich casks are obviously a lot more affordable and accessible than the likes of the Springbank and Macallans, but still they are quite unique in terms of they're not necessarily cheap. You're going to be looking at, you know, a more substantial outlay, and we'll get to how much they are in the video. So whether you're looking to buy one, this video will be a perfect sort of like beginner's guide for you. And you know what, even if you're not, this is an interesting little behind the scenes about the origins of the cask, where they'll come from, and all the practicalities, like the stuff that you don't really see behind the scenes of this industry. So obviously my day-to-day job is a whiskey broker. So if you are looking for a cask of Bruichladdich, then I can definitely help find one for you. So if you want one, just get in touch. And well, let's just dive into it. And let's begin with the obvious one, the obvious question then, of where did Bruichladdich casks come from? Because when you're buying a cask from the likes of me, you're not buying it directly from the distillery. The distillery, at the time of shooting this video, do not sell whiskey directly to the public. So you have to look at the casks that are in private ownership from historic schemes. Now, the distillery did used to sell casks to the public. There we go. And this is a cask offer from 2001. So broadly speaking, if you go back and watch the Springbank video about how to buy a cask of Springbank, I talked about a chap called Mark Rainier. Mark Rainier was a wine in the wine business in London, family business there, and he decided to start selling casks of Springbank as an alternative to, you know, somebody buying a pipe of port to give to a godchild or something. Now that was remarkably successful for him and for Springbank, so it's no surprise that when Mark Rainier and his various other investors reopened the Bruichladdich distillery, that they would do the same with Bruichladdich casks, because it gives you a much needed quick injection of cash for casks. So when you're buying a cask of Bruichladdich today, they're almost certainly going to be coming from previous historic owner of the casks. And if you're looking here, the cost in 2001 for a refill bourbon barrel, £775, £1,100 for a fresh sherry hogshead, or £2,195 for a fresh sherry butt. I don't know if you can believe those prices, but there they are. So you're buying them from other private individuals, and that's what I do. I'm an agent, I'm a broker, and my whole business is to broker these sales. So you can't go out and buy a new cask, but what you can buy are casks ranging from roughly 2001 all the way up to around 2011, 2012. They tend to be the latest releases that came out. There have been a few noted later. There have been a few parcels of a liquid that Bruichladdich have sold onto the industry that you can find about. But broadly speaking, they're in that 10-year window of 2001 to 2011, 12, somewhere in that region. Now, when you're buying a cask of Bruichladdich, you've got to remember that you can't call it Bruichladdich. What you can call it, though, or what you can say on the label, is that it was distilled at the Bruichladdich distillery. And this is the same for all casks that you buy in Scotland. You can't use the term Bruichladdich because that is a trademark term. What you can't trademark under trademark law in the UK is a geographic location, as in distilled at the Bruichladdich distillery. So if you wanted your own Bruichladdich and you wanted to bottle it, you couldn't just call it Bruichladdich, but you could say distilled at the Bruichladdich distillery with your name or your branding in bigger letters on the label. So again, Scotch Whisky Association regulations state that your brand has to be bigger than that of the description of the distillery. So if you imagine, a good example would be Gordon and MacPhail's Connoisseur's Choice. Gordon and MacPhail or Connoisseur's Choice is bigger than where it says distilled at the Bruichladdich distillery. So you can still label it as Bruichladdich, but you can't really say it's Bruichladdich, just Bruichladdich. Anyway, When you're buying a cask of Bruichladdich, you've got to remember a few important things. The first one is that most of the casks are all stored on Islay at the distillery, and it is not a given that you will, one, be able to continue to mature it at the distillery, two, whether that's a good idea to continue doing so, or three, that you will get any benefits from having it there. So broadly speaking, you shouldn't be paying a premium for a cask of Bruichladdich that is actually lying at the Bruichladdich distillery. Being at the distillery or being at a warehouse on the mainland doesn't make much difference. And perversely, a cask lying on the mainland might be more commercial, and you might be charged a premium for that simply because the work of moving it from Islay to the mainland distillery has already been done, because you can't take for granted that Bruichladdich will give you an account. Therefore, that when you purchase it, again, this can all be discussed prior to purchase, but you might assume that Bruichladdich won't give you a warehouse account, so you've then got to factor in cost of moving it over to the mainland, which is what we'll come to in a moment. So their storage policies, I would say, it's easy enough to assume that you may get an account, but I would say likewise work on the assumption that you won't. Like, work on the worst case scenario with all of this. So the casks themselves are not particularly expensive in the scheme of things. If you've watched the Macallan video, you're looking at 100,000, hundreds of thousands of pounds up to millions. With the Springbanks, of course, you're looking at tens up to mid hundreds of thousands of pounds there. But the Bruichladdich are a lot more affordable. You might be looking from mid high thousands, like 7, 8, 9,000 pounds for and we'll come back to address this in a moment, up to what's the most expensive Bruichladdich cask I've seen recently, maybe 20 to 30,000 pounds, somewhere in that region. But the reason being is, how much is a cask of Bruichladdich is an awkward question. It's a bit like saying, how much is a property in London? Well, a property and a cask are similar in terms of that they're vague descriptions. A property could be a one-bed studio flat, or it could be a 15-bed townhouse in the middle of Chelsea. A cask can be anything from, in the case of Bruichladdich, I think they did release some blood tubs, which are incredibly small casks, all the way up to port pipes or sherry casks. So the first thing that you've got to understand is that when you're buying a cask of Bruichladdich, the price that you're paying is not for the cask. It's a prorated valuation based on the amount of liquid that's remaining in the cask. So for instance, a bourbon barrel with, their 200 litres at fill has less than 50% of a sherry butt, which is typically 500 litres when it's first filled. So you're looking at a pro rata calculation. So saying it's what's it going to cost is not necessarily easy, because another factor that affects the price of a cask of Bruichladdich are things like the ABV. So a cask with a good healthy ABV, let's say 55, 60%, somewhere in that region, which isn't uncommon for some of these Bruichladdich, because some of them went in with a higher than average fill level, fill strength even, that might be suitable for 10 or 20 years more maturation. Whereas if you've got a cask that's down at 42, 45% ABV, it's going to have to be bottled sooner or rather than later. So, and that is reflected in the price, that it's not suitable for onward maturation, because it's that's going to have to become a commercial product very quickly. What affects the price as well is the type of wood that the whiskey's in. Now, as you've seen in this cask offer, there's all sorts of finishes here, from refill bourbon barrels. You've got rum barrels here as well. You've got refill bourbon hogsheads, refill sherry hogsheads, fresh sherry hogsheads, port hogsheads, sherry butts, refill and fresh fill. And then, of course, Bruichladdich, with Mark Rainier's guidance, also did a series of strange wine finishes. So Riva Salt has a very sweet dessert style wine. You also get some very big named red wine casks like Latour and Lafitte casks, even Petrus casks. With those, just bear in mind that even if you're sold a Bruichladdich Chateau Latour cask, you can't call it anything other than a Bruichladdich red wine cask on the label. Why? Because Latour, Chateau Latour, Petrus, Lafitte, they're all trademarks. They're not geographic locations. So you may pay a premium for it being in something like a Chateau Yquem cask. fantastic whiskey. If it makes fantastic whiskey, that sweet wine with the interaction of the whiskey makes fantastic whiskey. But you would only be able to say Sauternes finish on there, so that the eventual bottled product can't command a premium. The casks themselves sometimes command a premium because they're in arguably shorter supply than their more common mainstream ones like sherry and bourbon hogsheads. So there's so many little factors that come into play about the price. Now, the one thing that I would say about the Bruichladdich are that Mark Rainier was fanatical about wood. The wood selection policy, as is the same with Springbank, the wood selection policy is phenomenal. And you can almost be certain that the quality of the whiskey that you're buying is awesome. When you're buying one of these casks, it just will be awesome. The wood that they've gone into was all very carefully selected, especially ones for the public programs, because of course they didn't want to risk putting out any sort of inferior products there. Now, Bruichladdich being Bruichladdich, you don't just necessarily have to buy Bruichladdich. So the obvious thing is that Bruichladdich produces, 4 or 5 different styles of whiskey. So you've got straight up Bruichladdich, which is basically an unpeated whiskey, 3 to 5 ppm, somewhere in that region. It's basically unpeated. It's an Islay distillery, and most people associate an Islay distillery with peated whiskey. But that tradition of using peat was only there until the advent of the ferry boats, the steamboats that could bring coal in, which was much more efficient. So Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain, both set up and established after the arrival of the ferries, means that they're unpeated because they were traditionally not using peat. Now, that said, Bruichladdich also produces some very popular and well-named spirits that are peated. Port Charlotte, for instance, it's about 40 ppm, almost as peaty as Ardbeg. Very heavily peated. Port Charlotte casks do command a premium. Octomore is the other one. The world's most peated whiskey, anywhere from like 50 to 300 ppm. Now, again, very little Octomore exists in private ownership. A few of it was sold via directors and to friends of the directors, but very little of it is in private ownership. And perversely enough, look at any Octomore release on the market, it's very young. Why is it very young? Because the phenolic compounds break down as you mature it. So it's at its peatiest, most arrogant as a young whiskey. So therefore, if you want an Octomore, you're thinking very heavily peated, you would normally bottle it quite young. So a lot of these were bottled quite young. So there's very, very, very few casks of Octomore that are knocking around in private hands and therefore are available to purchase. There's obviously more Port Charlotte, but there's 2 more that you may or may not have heard of. Lochindaal. Lochindaal is a rarer style than Port Charlotte and is more heavily peated than Port Charlotte. I believe it's around 50 parts per million. And again, it does command a premium because it is a peated expression of Bruichladdich, and it is a very heavily peated one at that, especially if you can find any in sherry casks. Oh, absolutely wonderful whiskey. But going the other way, there's another type of cask, or a type of whiskey, sorry, that's incredibly rare, and that's Rhinns. Now that's, I think it's 20 to 30 ppm, somewhere in that region, so slightly less than Port Charlotte, you know, but more than the baseline Bruichladdich. So in terms of your order, you've got your Bruichladdich, you've got Rhinns, you've got Port Charlotte, you've got Lochindaal, and then you've got Octomore. So there's 5 expressions there. And of course, mixing those 5 expressions with any number of 10 different cask types, with any number of 1,000 different ABVs and 1,000 different fill levels, you soon see the infinite number of possibilities for cask prices because there's so many things that are affecting it. Now, when you're buying it, what provenance should you be looking for? When Bruichladdich sold these casks to the public, they were a distillery selling them to the public. They were the warehouse keepers, and they were transferring the ownership themselves. So they gave the owners a certificate. The certificate is meaningless to anybody else other than the original owner. The ownership is transferred by means of a delivery order. So that is signed by the buyer and signed by the seller, and it transfers the ownership. That is the only paperwork that you need for this. Any bits of superfluous paperwork that come with it, you know what, they're nice to have, and in some cases they do or do not exist. If I said to you, have you got the receipt for your TV that you bought back in 2001, you'd probably say no. But these casks weren't typically very expensive, like £1,000, starting at £1,000. they were not as coveted as they are now. And these people, foresight, huge credit to everybody who bought these originally, because they had the foresight to buy them when nobody else was. They were supporting the distillery and things. But that delivery order is the only piece of paperwork that you need on any purchase. The provenance of them is important, but also not important, because it's important in the fact of, like, you wouldn't buy anything without provenance, but the provenance comes from the fact that is it still in a bonded warehouse? Well, yes, obviously. And therefore you've got gold-plated provenance. Why? Because every single cask of whisky that's distilled in Scotland has a tax debt to our government, HMRC. So when these first casks were laid down in 2001, a little tax debt was created at HMRC for that cask and that cask number for the VAT and the duty if it was bottled in the UK. In 2025 now, that tax debt is still outstanding. So when you bottle this cask, assuming that you bottle it in the UK, you're going to have to pay HMRC the VAT and duty that's due, and they will close that debt on their records. And every month, Bruichladdich and every other warehouse in Scotland has to go through a W1, or it's like a self-reporting audit, and basically account for every single millilitre in and out. So essentially, if a cask is being bottled, they need to say to HMRC, this cask is being bottled, here's the VAT and the duty that we collected on it, you can close that debt. Likewise, if you're transferring that cask or you're bottling that cask and the bottles are going to be shipped to America or Taiwan or Singapore, somewhere like that, the warehouse keeper has to prove that that whiskey has been exported so that HMRC can close that debt off. So what's the best provenance? The best provenance is a government that monitors it for tax purposes. Probably one of the most important functions for government, isn't it, really? So you do have that incredible provenance with the being in these excise warehouses or bonded warehouses. Now, that's not to say that casks and buying a cask of Bruichladdich isn't without risk. Biggest risk, overpaying for it. There's very few frames of reference, and I've seen so many people be ripped off by other brokers because they've been charged way too much for something, and that is essentially how fraud happens in the whiskey industry. In the watch world, in the wine world, people make fake products, fake Rolexes, fake bottles of wine. Well, it's not really worth doing that for whiskey when you can just say to somebody, pay me 25 grand for this cask that's worth 10. Like, you've not even had to manufacture a product. So all the fraud has historically come from the manipulation of pricing or not giving delivery orders, and therefore like Ponzi selling casks and stuff. Another risk is obviously the ABV. If you bottle a cask of whiskey at 39%, well, it's not whiskey, it's a spirit drink, because the Scotch Whisky Association or the Scotch Whisky Regulations state that it has to be over 40% to be legally called Scotch whisky. So that's an important thing to monitor, because if you let it mature too far and you let the evaporation take hold too much, then you might be coming back to an empty cask or a cask that's below 40% of an ABV. So you've got to monitor the cask regularly with regauges. Now, what we do with regauges, if you're buying a cask from us, we'll provide you with the regauge details when you're making your first inquiry. And then if that regauge is older than 3 months, when we come to the point of invoice, the cask will be regauged again, and it'll be the invoice will be pro rata adjusted on that basis. So again, just a reminder, I'll put my email address down in the comments. If you're interested in buying a cask of Bruichladdich, get in touch and I'll be happy to help. Now, another thing that can't be forgotten about are ongoing costs, in terms of what are the ongoing costs of this. Well, insurance is one that most people think about initially, and company that I recommend in Scotland is called Howdens. They pretty much provide all of the warehouse insurance cover for the industry. They provide distillery insurance cover, and they provide private cover. Roughly £350, somewhere in that region, buys you £100,000 worth of cover, which is a lot of cover for not very much, and that's because you need to check the terms and conditions, because you can't insure against things like evaporation or leaks. So that's just inherent vice in the product. What you could do, though, is ask the warehouse keeper, and we'll get onto this in a moment, whether they'll store your cask above an empty IBC if there's any leaks and stuff. But of course, that will be collected into the IBC and not onto the warehouse floor. But that would mean that you're taking up 2 spaces in the warehouse and not just 1. And for a cask of Bruichladdich, it might not necessarily be worth doing that, but that brings you on to the obvious question of how much should you be paying for storage. Typically, It's in the region, I think at the distillery, it's somewhere in the region of £50 to £100 a year. Most warehouses on the mainland are around £100 for a hogshead or barrel and around £200 for a sherry butt. You can, of course, get cheaper warehousing than that, but you pay for what you get in terms of some setups are more orientated towards the trade, some setups are more orientated towards the public. Some setups might check and inspect the barrel every day, every week, every month if you pay and ask them to. Some might just say, no, I'm storing the cask here for you. So this is, again, what my role as a broker is to help you understand all of these nuances before you make a purchase. Now, when you're bottling the cask, let's say that you're bottling it in the obvious way to say this is that your taxes are due where the whiskey is imported, so it's locally. So if you're importing the whiskey into America, you'll be paying the taxes at the American rates, or into like Hong Kong, you'll be paying taxes on the Hong Kong rates, and in the UK, you'll be paying duty on the liquid plus VAT, and then you'll be paying VAT on the value of the liquid. Now, the more harder question to answer is how much does it cost to bottle? If you stick it in a tall round bottle like this, it might not cost very much. It might cost you £3, £5 per bottle. If you want a lead crystal decanter from Glencairn with a stopper, it might cost you £50 a bottle. But likewise, you could bottle in the Glencairn Supreme at £5.50 a bottle with a nice wooden stopper and a capsule, and they're the same ones that are used for the Curacao Geisha bottles. But it's not going to look like a Curacao Geisha bottle unless you're spending a lot of money on the labelling. And then you end up in another whole can of worms. Are you designing it for yourself? Are you designing it with a local designer? Are you using an industry designer? Or are you using a world-class industry designer? Because we've got contacts at all of those places, so we can help you create this product. Now, the final point that I'm going to touch on is like, how easy is it to resell these casks? Well, that should not even form part of your vocabulary. You should be buying this because this is an interesting project to bottle and sell yourself, whether an independent bottler or whether you're a private individual that just wants to own your own cask of Bruichladdich to sort of like to own and bottle at some point in the future. We sell a lot of Bruichladdich nowadays to bars and for slightly more premium casks to the likes of restaurants, casinos and hotels and car dealerships and things, people who want to invest their capital into or be associated with a whiskey brand, buy their own whiskey releases. So that's more of it. As an investment, like, yes, historically these casks have gone up incredibly in value, but go to any financial advisor and they will tell you how risky a cask investment is. My own take on it is that as long as Scotch whiskey continues to, or the value of Scotch whiskey continues to be dictated by the age statement and not the quality, and let's argue about that in another video, because that basically is the truth, whether people like it or not. Every distillery prices according to age statements rather than quality, with a few exceptions. Ardbeg and people like that don't have many age statements. But that's the exception to the rule, is that yes, potentially as an investment for the future, if everything continues as normal, it could continue to grow in value. But if you're looking at it as an investment, you need to be looking at a cask that's suitable for investment rather than one that's suitable for bottling. Buying a cask of whiskey as well to bottle is something that it's a unique opportunity that you can't really have compared to anything else that you do in any other sector. Like if you're a Rolex super collector, you still can't make your own Rolex. If you're a Chateau Lafite super fan, you can't make your own Chateau Lafite. But with whiskey, you can have your own unique thumbprint on a cask of whiskey, a single cask release that will never be released to the market again, packaged in a way that you wanted, produced and marketed in a way that you wanted. So as an incredible life experience, there's nothing else like it. So there's pretty much everything that you need to know about buying a cask of Bruichladdich. If you need one, get in touch. I'll put my email down below. And if you've just come along for the ride, hopefully there's been a few interesting bits of tidbits there for you. So there you go. Should we continue doing more of these videos? Get in the comments and let me know.